This video is sponsored by Squarespace. If you're interested in an easy to make yet unbelievably stunning website or online store, Squarespace has you covered. More on that later though. And also, there's just so much going on right now. Make sure to stick around until the end of the video for information on a super awesome giveaway that you can win a DJI OSMO Pocket. Okay, let's get into the video. What is up people, Dunna here, and today we're going to be talking about arguably one of the most important things that you can learn as a photographer or videographer, the exposure triangle and how you can properly balance your settings to get better pictures and videos. But before we get too far into it, make sure to head down and leave a comment, let me know how you get your exposure properly, and on your way down, hit that like button. The goal here is to explain the idea behind our settings in not only a technical way, but also in a real life kind of way so that you can learn this stuff and take it out and get great shots with it. We're gonna start with the explanation of each setting, but later on I'm gonna talk about some practical situations and how you can make good decisions using the things that you've learned in this video. Okay, let's start with the three different settings that make up the exposure triangle. We have aperture, we have shutter speed, and we have ISO. Each of these settings can increase or decrease the brightness in your picture. But each of them also affects other aspects of your picture, so choosing which one you adjust is extremely important. Let's kick things off with aperture. The extremely simple explanation of aperture is that it's the size of the hole allowing light through the lens. Inside the lens, there are things called aperture blades that control the size of the hole. If they move inwards, they're going to get smaller. If they move outwards, you guessed it, the hole gets bigger. The bigger the hole is, the more light gets through the lens and hits the sensor, which in turn makes the image brighter. Bigger hole, more light, brighter image. Now here's where it feels like it gets a little bit backwards. Aperture is expressed in a number beside the letter F. You may have heard of this as an f-stop. If the number is bigger, the hole is smaller and the image is darker. If the number is smaller, the hole is bigger and the image is brighter. So an aperture of f11 is much darker than an aperture of f4 or an aperture of f1.4. Now remember earlier how I said that these settings also affect other aspects of your image as well? Aperture also affects the depth of field of your image. I'm not gonna go into this in depth, pun intended, but basically it means how much of your picture is in focus. At a high numbered aperture like f11, whatever you focused on will obviously be in focus, but so will a bunch behind and in front of the subject. This is good for things like landscape shots where you want lots of the frame in focus, or if you have multiple subjects at different distances from the camera that you want all in focus at the same time. On the other end of the scale, a small numbered aperture means that whatever you focus on will be in focus, but the things behind and in front of it will be out of focus, the blurry background. People love this for things like portraits because they can have their subject in focus and the background totally blurred out so you can't even tell what it is. This gives separation from the subject and the background. So to recap aperture, a big number means less light and lots in focus, and a small number means more light but only the subject is in focus. And then obviously we have varying numbers between those two extremes. Okay, we'll come back to aperture for the practical examples, but let's move on to shutter speed for now. Shutter speed is the length of time that the shutter of the camera is open. The shutter shuts to stop light from hitting the sensor. The longer the shutter is open, the more light is able to be gathered by the sensor and the brighter the image will be. We refer to this as shutter speed, and it's measured in seconds and fractions of seconds. Now, until you get used to it, the numbers can be a bit confusing when you're looking at your camera. On my camera, if I go all the way to the slowest shutter speed, it says 30 with a quotation mark. This means 30 seconds, which is an extremely long shutter speed used for what we call long exposures. As I move right to the faster shutter speeds, you'll eventually see decimal places. But then right after 0.4 seconds, it says 3. This doesn't mean 3 seconds. Notice that there's no quotation mark anymore, which indicated seconds before. This now means 1/3 of a second. As I keep moving, we'll see 1/4 of a second, 1/5 of a second, and so on all the way up to the fastest on my camera, which is 1/4000th of a second. So if things are too dark in our image, we can make the shutter speed slower, and if things are too bright in our image, we can make it faster. But this is another one of those things that has two parts to it. Shutter speed also determines how the camera captures motion. For example, let's say I had a 1 second shutter speed, which is pretty long in general. If our subject or the camera moves at all during that 1 second that the shutter is open, it's going to be blurred all over the frame. If the camera is on a tripod, you don't have to worry about the camera movements, and if your subject isn't moving, or if you wanted to get that subject blurred, then that's okay too, so you can use this if you want. Generally for portraits and the small movements that humans naturally make even when we think we're standing still, I like to be at about 1/160th of a second or faster. Now for video, it's a bit different. There's a general rule to make the shutter speed, and therefore the amount of motion blur, more pleasing to the eye. Whatever your frame rate is, 24, 30, 60, or 120 frames per second, typically in North America, you're gonna wanna double that with the shutter speed. So for example, at 24 frames per second, the shutter speed of 1/48th of a second. My camera doesn't do exactly 1/48th, so I use 1/50th of a second. For 60 frames per second, the shutter speed would be 1/120th of a second, and so on and so forth. This will give you a kind of standard, pleasing amount of motion blur in your video, but you can play with that as you want. A slower shutter speed will make your video kind of blurry and dreamy looking. It's kind of the look when you see someone's been given a tranquilizer and is falling asleep in movies. A faster shutter speed will make things super crisp and clean, but not super realistic. This can be used for things like fight scenes where you want to make things seem more intense than they are. So, to recap shutter speed, the shorter the shutter speed means less light and less motion blur. The longer shutter speed means more light and more motion blur. The third part of the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO is pretty simple. It increases or decreases the sensitivity of the sensor to light. The higher the number, the brighter the image. The lower the number, the darker the image. Finally, something that makes sense. But just like aperture and shutter speed, it also has a trade-off. The higher you have to push that ISO number, the more noise or grain you'll get in your image, and the quality will also decrease. Every camera is different in this regard, and you're going to have to get used to your camera to find out how far you can push it and still get a usable image. With my Sony a6500, I find I can go about to ISO 6400 if I really need to, but generally I try and max out at ISO 1600 if I can. The lower that number is, the better the quality will be. So to recap ISO, high number means more light, more noise, and decreased quality. A low number means less light, but a higher quality and overall cleaner image. Whew, that was a lot. If you need to pause, go back and watch any of that again, go ahead. If not, we're gonna put it all together and talk about how you can use all of that knowledge. But first, let's talk about the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. First off, I've been using Squarespace for a long time now, and I've made several different websites with them. They empower people like you and me by giving us the tools that we need to bring our ideas to life. With Squarespace, you can get a domain, build a site, sell things online, and market your brand. It's actually so easy to make an incredible website with their awesome award-winning templates that are built as a starting point for a wide range of different projects. One of my favorite things is how easy it is to update and change your website since you need zero knowledge of fancy code and such. And if you're having any trouble, they have fantastic 24/7 customer support with tons of different webinars and help guides to get you going. I recently started using their Squarespace email campaigns for my Dunna Did It notification squad. Email campaigns are a great way to stay connected to your community and customers. So if you've been thinking about making a website or an online store, check out the link in the description to head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch your site, go to squarespace.com/DunnaDidIt to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain. Okay, you get enough of a break. Let's get back into it. So now we know what the different parts of the exposure triangle, let's figure out how to use that knowledge all together. The reason it's called the exposure triangle is to emphasize the connection between all of the different points of the triangle. You need to learn to mix the three different settings in order to balance between the qualities you want in the image and getting the proper exposure or brightness. In order to keep this simple, I've broken the process down into 3 steps to get proper exposure. Number 1, try to estimate the aperture and shutter speed that you think you'll need to create that perfect shot that you want, kind of ignoring the light to start with. What I mean by this is choosing the aperture that will give you the proper depth of field that you want. For portraits, I often like 1.4 or 2.8 for a nice shallow depth of field. For landscape, I often shoot at f8 or f11 to try and get more of the frame in focus. Then choose the shutter speed for whether you want the motion frozen or if you want it blurred. If there's no motion in your shot, you can kind of forget this for now. Number 2 is to set your ISO at the lowest possible and gradually bring it up until you feel happy with the exposure. There are lots of different opinions on the perfect exposure that I'll save for another time, so just go with what you think looks good to start with. Number 3 is to adjust accordingly. If you've had to bring your ISO up too high for your camera to still give you a clean image, you may want to try and get more light by making your aperture wider or by slowing down your shutter speed so that you can bring the ISO down a bit. If your ISO is already as low as it goes and the exposure is still too bright, you may have to sacrifice shutter speed or aperture a bit to make up for this. For photography, I typically will increase my shutter speed first and try to preserve my aperture if I can. The reason for this is generally if I'm trying to freeze motion, whether it's 1/200th of a second or 1/4000th of a second, it doesn't really matter. You can also use something called an ND filter, but that's going to be for another video as well. Let's assume for now you don't know what that is and you don't have one on you. Now things become a little bit different with video because typically you want to keep your shutter speed steady using the formula that we talked about earlier. So now you really only have 2 of the 3 parts to play with, but the general idea is the same. If it's too dark, we can go to a lower f-stop, which will change the depth of field, or we can increase ISO, which will add noise. If it's too bright, assuming your ISO is already as low as it goes, you can go to a higher f-stop, again changing your depth of field. So that's the exposure triangle and how you can use it to get your photos and videos looking spot on. Leave a comment below and let me know if you have a method or specific settings that you like to use to get your exposure. And on your way down, hit that like and subscribe button. And before you go, it's giveaway time. I've teamed up with some other fantastic YouTubers to give you the chance to win a DJI OSMO Pocket. All you have to do is go to the link in the description and follow the instructions. The more channels you subscribe to, the more chances you have to win. The winner will be announced in a couple of weeks, so go make sure to enter now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Perfect. Perfect.